The train pulled into Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Elena Navarro stepped off the platform with a carpet bag in one hand and a letter in the other. The letter was from a man named Gerald Holt. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The ink slightly smeared in two places from what she told herself was humidity. Gerald Holt had written to her 6 months ago through a matrimonial agency based in Boston, a respectable outfit run by a woman named Mrs. Adler, who charged $12 for her services and promised discretion above all else. He had described himself as a rancher of modest but stable means, a widower of 3 years, a man looking for a partner rather than a decoration. He had asked if she could cook. She had said yes. He had asked if she was afraid of hard work. She had said no. He had asked if she had family she'd be leaving behind. She had paused over that one for a long moment before writing. No one who would notice. That had apparently been the right answer, because 2 weeks later a second letter arrived with a train ticket enclosed and a note that said, "Come in October, I'll be at the station." He was at the station. She saw him the moment she stepped off the train, a broad-shouldered man in a brown canvas coat, holding his hat in both hands, squinting through the morning light. He was older than she'd imagined from his letters, somewhere past 50, with deep-set eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than ordinary bone. Behind him stood 2 other men she didn't recognize, and a woman in a dark wool coat who kept her arms crossed and her face turned slightly away, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Elena walked toward him because there was no one else to walk toward. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'm Elena Navarro. We've been corresponding." He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's not sure he wants to buy. Slow, deliberate, starting at her face and working down, then back up. "Navarro," he said. "Yes. That's a Spanish name. My father was from Castile. My mother was from Massachusetts. I grew up in Boston." Gerald Holt's jaw shifted. He put his hat back on his head, which she would later understand was a gesture that meant the conversation was over before it had properly started. "Mrs. Adler didn't mention that," he said. "I don't see why it would be relevant." "It's relevant to me." The woman in the dark coat made a small sound. Not a laugh. Not quite. Something between amusement and satisfaction, like a cat watching something fall. "Gerald," one of the men behind him said, low and cautious. "I run a ranch," Holt said. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking somewhere past her right shoulder, at the train or the mountains beyond it, or nothing in particular. "I've got hands who work for me, men with families in this town. I've got a reputation that took me 30 years to build." "I understand," Elena said, though she was beginning to understand something she hadn't anticipated. "I don't think you do." He finally looked at her again. "I sent for someone who could fit in here. Someone people wouldn't—" He stopped. Started again. "This is a particular kind of place, Miss Navarro. People here have particular kinds of expectations." She held very still. She had learned over the years that holding still was sometimes the only defense a person had. "Are you telling me," she said carefully, "that you're refusing the arrangement? I'm telling you that I made an assumption, and the assumption was wrong, and I'm sorry for your trouble." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to her. "There's enough in there for a ticket back to Boston and a meal or two along the way. It's the decent thing." Elena looked at the envelope. She did not take it. "Keep it," she said. "Miss Navarro. Keep your money, Mr. Holt." She turned around and walked back toward the station house, and she did not look at any of them. Not Holt, not the woman in the dark coat, not the 2 men who had witnessed the whole thing and were now studying their boots with tremendous concentration. She walked through the door of the station house and sat down on the first bench she found, and set her carpet bag on the floor between her feet and stared at the opposite wall. The station master was an older man with silver whiskers and a pen tucked behind his ear. He glanced at her once, then went back to his ledger. Outside, she could hear the train beginning to move again, the slow churn of iron wheels taking it further west toward places she hadn't planned to go. She had $43 and some cents in her purse. She had a carpet bag with 2 dresses, 1 pair of spare boots, a tin of hand salve, a book she'd read 3 times already, and a small photograph of her mother in a frame no bigger than her palm. She had a letter from Gerald Holt that was no longer worth anything, and she had a return ticket she hadn't purchased because she had not planned on needing one. She was 26 years old, and she was sitting in a train station in Wyoming, and she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. The thing about humiliation is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves. The first wave is the shock, the sudden cold of it, the disbelief that makes everything feel slightly unreal, like you're watching yourself from a short distance. The second wave is the shame, which is worse, because by then you understand exactly what happened, and you can't pretend anymore that you misheard or misunderstood. The third wave is the anger. Elena had learned to count on the anger. It was the only one of the three that was actually useful. She sat in the station house for the better part of an hour, moving through those waves one at a time, and by the time she got to the anger, she had also gotten to something that resembled a plan. She wasn't going back to Boston. That was the first thing. Boston had her aunt's house on Tilton Street, where she had lived for the past 4 years after her mother passed, sleeping in a room barely big enough for a cot and a washstand, helping with the children and the cooking in exchange for the roof over her head. Her aunt was a decent enough woman, not unkind exactly, but the kind of person who kept a careful accounting of everything she gave and expected it returned in full. Going back to Tilton Street meant going back to that accounting. It meant admitting she had failed at the one thing she had staked everything on. It meant the particular look her aunt would give her. Not cruel, just tired, just resigned. And Elena found she would rather face Wyoming than that look. So she wasn't going back. That much was settled. What she was going to do instead remained considerably less clear. She opened her purse and counted her money again, which didn't improve the situation, but at least made it concrete. $43.22. In Boston, that would keep her for maybe a month if she was careful. She had no idea what things cost in Wyoming. "Excuse me," she said to the station master. He looked up. "Is there a hotel in town, something reasonably priced?" He considered this. "Mrs. Dwyer runs a boarding house on 2nd Street. She's fair." He paused. "She's also particular about her tenants. Quiet house. No trouble." "I have no intention of causing trouble," Elena said. He nodded slowly, the way men nodded when they were reserving judgment. 50 cents a night. $1.50 for the week, meals included. Elena calculated quickly. A week at Mrs. Dwyer's. That gave her time to figure something out, or at least to figure out what she was figuring out. "Can you tell me how to get there?" Iron Ridge was not what she had imagined. She had pictured something rough and temporary, the kind of town that seemed to be apologizing for existing. Raw lumber buildings, mud streets, the whole place feeling like it might blow away in a strong wind. What she found was something more complicated than that. There were rough lumber buildings, certainly, but there were also a handful of proper brick storefronts along the main street, and a schoolhouse that looked recently painted, and a hardware store with a window display that suggested someone gave thought to such things. The streets were dirt, deeply rutted from wagon traffic, but there were boardwalks on both sides of Main Street, and most of them were in reasonable repair. It was a real town. Not a finished town, not a polished town, but a town that was in the process of becoming something and hadn't decided yet what that something was. People watched her as she walked. Not openly. Mostly through windows, or with the quick sideways glance that people use when they want to look without being caught looking. She kept her head up and her pace even and pretended not to notice, which she had also learned over the years was a useful skill. Mrs. Dwyer's boarding house was exactly what the station master had promised. A clean, quiet house run by a woman who appeared to be around 60, with iron gray hair pinned into a severe knot in a manner that was simultaneously welcoming and non-negotiable. 2 weeks in advance, Mrs. Dwyer said, after Elena had explained her situation in the most practical terms she could manage. Arrived to meet a man. Arrangement fell through, looking for temporary accommodation while she sorted her next steps. "I thought you said $1.50 per week." "For permanent tenants, yes. For travelers, 2 weeks in advance is my policy. If you stay longer, we settle the difference." Elena counted out $3 from her purse and tried not to think about how much that left. The room was small but clean. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out onto a narrow yard where chickens moved around in a disorganized way. There was a hook on the door for her coat and a small chest of drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. It was, in its stripped-down way, functional. She had lived in worse. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself approximately 3 minutes of something that was not quite crying, more like her eyes doing something unfortunate without her full permission. And then she washed her face with the cold water from the pitcher and changed into her second dress and went downstairs to eat whatever Mrs. Dwyer was offering for the midday meal. There were 3 other boarders at the table. A traveling salesman named Perch, who sold dry goods and seemed deeply invested in talking about himself. A young man of about 20 who worked at the telegraph office and barely said anything at all. And an older woman named Mrs. Cross, who had come to Iron Ridge to live with her son's family and was apparently finding the experience less satisfying than anticipated. Mrs. Cross looked at Elena with the kind of frank appraisal that older women sometimes permitted themselves, the social contract of polite pretense suspended in favor of direct evaluation. "You're the one Gerald Holt sent away this morning," she said. Not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, the way you might observe that it was cold out. Elena looked up from her soup. "News travels quickly here. Small town. Everything travels quickly." Mrs. Cross broke a piece of cornbread in half. "He's a fool, for what it's worth. His first wife was half Mexican, and she was worth 10 of him." The salesman cleared his throat. The telegraph boy looked at his bowl. "Thank you," Elena said, because she wasn't sure what else to say to that. She spent the next 3 days doing what she had always done in difficult situations, which was to think very methodically about the problem in front of her and try to be honest about what her actual options were. Option 1, return to Boston. She had already decided against this, but she turned it over again just to be thorough. No, not if she could help it. Option 2, take the next train west to whatever was at the end of the line. She had heard of women going to San Francisco or Portland and finding work in hotels, or as seamstresses, or in various other capacities. This was possible, but it required money she didn't have enough of, and the uncertainty of it felt like trading one unknown for a worse one. Option 3, find work in Iron Ridge. This was the option that kept coming back to her, and she wasn't entirely sure whether that was wisdom or stubbornness. Probably both. The problem with option 3 was that she didn't know what work was available, and the town's opinion of her, at least the portion of town that overlapped with Gerald Holt's social circle, was not particularly promising. Still, she was good at numbers. She had kept her aunt's household accounts for 4 years and had never once made an error that didn't originate from her aunt's own faulty memory. She could cook adequately and clean thoroughly, and she had some experience with mending and basic sewing. She could read and write in both English and Spanish, which felt irrelevant here but was at least a fact about her. She had, over the course of a difficult young life, gotten fairly good at making things work in situations that weren't set up for working. She went to the mercantile first because it was the most visible business on the main street and therefore, she reasoned, the most likely to have useful information about what else was available. The man behind the counter was thick-set and amiable, with a red face that suggested either robust health or fondness for drink, or possibly both. He introduced himself as Mercer and listened to her inquiry without interrupting, which she appreciated. "Work," he said when she'd finished. "What kind of work?" "Whatever's available. I can keep accounts, I can cook, I can manage a household." Mercer scratched the back of his neck. "There's not much call for account keeping in a place this size. Most folks handle their own. Mildred Crane does the washing for about half the town, but she's pretty well established, and I don't think she's looking for help." He thought for a moment. "You might try the hotel. The Frontier House, down at the end of Main. They sometimes need help with the dining room." "I'll try that." And he hesitated in a way that suggested he was deciding whether to say something. "You might want to know, if you don't already, that Gerald Holt and the Frontier House owner are drinking companions, just so you're prepared." Elena absorbed this. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the warning." The Frontier House's owner was a narrow man named Aldridge, who looked at her with a kind of studied neutrality that was worse than open hostility because it was harder to argue with. He said he had no current openings. He said it in a tone that suggested he would have no current openings for the foreseeable future regardless of circumstances. She tried the bakery. The baker, a round woman named Stella, was friendly enough but already had her daughter helping in the back. She tried the dressmaker, who was a one-woman operation and saw no need to change that. She tried a laundry service that turned out to have gone out of business 2 weeks prior, which she only discovered after walking to the wrong end of town. By the end of the third day, she had $40.22 and a more detailed picture of Iron Ridge's employment landscape, which was not encouraging. She sat at Mrs. Dwyer's supper table and ate her salt pork and potatoes and tried to think like someone who was not currently losing ground. Mrs. Cross watched her from across the table with those shrewd eyes. "You're stubborn," she observed. "I prefer determined," Elena said. "Same thing, different wallpaper." Mrs. Cross put down her fork. "You know, Holt's been telling people you came here under false pretenses, that you misrepresented yourself to the agency." Elena set her own fork down carefully. "That's a lie." "I know it is. Doesn't change that he's saying it." "What does he claim I misrepresented?" Mrs. Cross shrugged. "He's vague about the details, which is the smart way to lie. Just enough suggestion to make people wonder." The salesman, Perch, had the decency to look uncomfortable. The telegraph boy was apparently deeply fascinated by a spot on the tablecloth. Elena picked her fork back up. "Then I suppose I'll have to show people something more substantial than his word," she said. She didn't say it with particular force or drama. It was just the only reasonable conclusion she could see. The fourth morning brought cold weather, a front that had come down from the north overnight, dropping the temperature sharply and turning the mud in the streets to something closer to iron. Elena pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the edge of town, where she'd heard there was a feed store that might need a bookkeeper for the seasonal inventory rush. She was perhaps 3 blocks from Mrs. Dwyer's when she heard the voice. "Lady! Lady! Wait!" It was high-pitched and breathless, and coming from somewhere to her left. She turned. The girl was maybe 7 or 8, with dark red hair coming out of a braid that had clearly been put in at the start of the day, and was losing the battle badly. She had a smudge of something, mud or grease, it was hard to tell, across her left cheek, and she was running toward Elena with the single-minded purpose of someone who had decided on a course of action and wasn't going to be slowed down by anything as minor as physics. She stopped about 2 feet away, breathing hard, and stared up at Elena with pale blue eyes that were startlingly direct. "Are you the lady from the train?" she asked. "I arrived by train, yes," Elena said. "Who are you?" "Ruby Callahan. My pa's ranch is outside town. We came in for feed." She looked Elena up and down in a way that was appraising but not unfriendly. "You don't look like you're from here." "I'm not. I'm from Boston." "Is that far?" "Very." Ruby seemed to consider the implications of this. "Why are you still here?" "Mrs. Norris. She lives next to the livery. She told Mrs. Partridge that you were going to leave on the next train." "Mrs. Norris," Elena said, "doesn't know as much as she thinks she does." Something shifted in the girl's face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the thing that comes just before the decision to find something funny. "Pa says that about a lot of people here," she said. "He doesn't say it out loud usually, but sometimes I can tell he's thinking it." Elena looked at this child, this small, direct, somewhat windblown child who was standing in the cold talking to a stranger with the confident ease of someone who had never been told that strangers were something to be cautious of. There was something appealing about that confidence. Also, possibly, something concerning. "Ruby," she said, "does your father know you're over here talking to me? He's getting the feed loaded." Ruby glanced back over her shoulder. "He'll be a minute. He doesn't always notice when I wander?" "I see." "He's got a lot on his mind," Ruby said, with the patient tone of someone explaining a complicated situation to someone who might not fully grasp it. "Since Mama died, he mostly just thinks about the ranch and me, and sometimes he forgets to pay attention to which one he's doing." She paused. "That came out wrong." "No," Elena said. "I understood what you meant. He's a good pa. He just—" Ruby frowned, searching for the word. "He just doesn't always notice things. Like when I'm cold, or when the cornbread is burning, or when I've wandered off." "How long ago did your mother die?" 2 years. I was 6. Ruby said it with the matter-of-factness of a child who has processed the fact enough times to be able to state it without flinching, but there was something underneath it, some weight that the flat tone was carrying. Pa cried for a long time. He didn't think I could tell, but I could. Elena stood in the cold street looking at this girl and felt something she couldn't immediately name, a kind of ache that was partly the child herself and partly something else, some recognition she wasn't quite ready to examine directly. "Ruby." A man's voice from further up the street. Not angry, but with the particular edge of someone who has just noticed something they should have noticed 5 minutes ago. Ruby, where? He came around the side of a wagon. He was taller than Elena had expected from the child's description. Not that she'd been picturing him, but if she had been. With dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been weathered by things that had nothing to do with the outdoors. He was wearing a coat that had seen better days and work boots that were thoroughly broken in, and he moved with the slightly stiff gait of someone who'd spent too many years doing the kind of work that accumulates in your back. He stopped when he saw Elena. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. He looked at Ruby with an expression that was trying to be stern and not quite getting there. "Ruby, you can't just go up to strangers." "She doesn't seem like a stranger," Ruby said reasonably. That's not how it works." He looked back at Elena. There was a moment of awkward recognition. He clearly knew who she was, or at least knew enough of the story that had been circulating, and she could see him working through how to handle that without being unkind. "I apologize for my daughter. She doesn't always—" "She was perfectly pleasant," Elena said. "No apology needed." He pulled his hat off, which in her brief experience of frontier men, she was beginning to understand as a gesture that meant they were taking the conversation seriously. "Cole Callahan, my ranch is about 4 miles east of town. Elena Navarro." "I know. He stopped. "I heard about what happened with Holt. I'm sorry, that was—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the way he left it hanging suggested he had a fairly accurate assessment of what it was. "It was what it was," Elena said. Cole Callahan looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that had something tired in them, but not the kind of tired that comes from a bad night's sleep, the kind that comes from a long time of carrying things alone. Do you have somewhere to go? Are you staying in town?" "For the time being." He nodded. He put his hat back on, which apparently was the gesture that meant the serious part of the conversation was concluding. "Right. Well, good." He looked at Ruby. "Come on, Ruby. We need to get back before dark." Ruby looked at Elena with those direct, pale eyes. "It was nice to meet you," she said, with a gravity that seemed slightly too large for an 8-year-old, but suited her somehow. "And you," Elena said. She watched them walk back toward the wagon, the tall man with the tired walk and the small girl with the escaping braid, and then she turned and kept walking toward the feed store. She didn't think about them again, or rather, she tried not to. The feed store was a dead end. The owner had managed his own accounts for 20 years and saw no reason to change that. He was polite about it, which was more than some, but polite didn't pay for a room at Mrs. Dwyer's. He was walking back along the main street, thinking hard, when she passed the window of the hardware store and saw, taped in the lower corner of the glass, a handwritten notice. "Help wanted. Ranch work. Cooking and household management. Temporary position. Inquire at the Callahan Ranch, 4 miles east on the Bitter Creek Road." She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she went inside and asked the hardware man when the notice had been put up. "Oh, that's been there a while," he said. "Few weeks. Cole Callahan put it up. Lost his housekeeper. Woman named Mrs. Baxter. Been with him years. She moved to Denver to be near her sister. He's been struggling to manage on his own, from what I hear." Elena looked at the notice again. 4 miles east on the Bitter Creek Road. "He's a good man," the hardware man offered. "Not the talkative type, but fair. Pays what he says he'll pay, which isn't something you can count on with everyone around here." She bought a small tin of shoe polish she didn't particularly need because it seemed rude to ask questions without buying anything, and walked back to Mrs. Dwyer's to think. The problem was obvious, and she could see it clearly. Going to work at the Callahan Ranch would be, by any objective measure, the most sensible thing available to her. It would solve the immediate problem of money. It was honest work. The man had seemed, in their brief exchange, to be what the hardware dealer said. Not warm, exactly, but not unkind. And his daughter had been watching her with those earnest eyes in a way that Elena found it difficult to be unaffected by. The other problem was also obvious. Gerald Holt had already started rumors about her. Going to work on a ranch, a widower's ranch, 4 miles outside town, would give those rumors something to attach to. People would say things. Some of them would probably say them loudly. She sat at Mrs. Dwyer's kitchen table and work through this the way she worked through every problem, by lining up the actual facts and seeing what they said. Fact: she needed work. Fact: this was the only position available that matched her skills. Fact: she had already been publicly humiliated once, and the opinion of people who would make assumptions about her was, frankly, not something she had much capacity left to be governed by. She finished her coffee. She went upstairs and repacked her carpet bag. The next morning, she hired the livery's oldest, steadiest horse for 3 days and rode 4 miles east on the Bitter Creek Road. The Callahan Ranch was not what she would have called prosperous. She recognized that fact without judgment, the way you recognize a mathematical result. It was simply what the evidence suggested. The house was a solid enough structure, 2 stories, built from good timber, but it needed paint and at least 2 of the porch steps needed replacing. The barn looked better maintained than the house, which told her something about where the priorities were. There were cattle in the south pasture. She couldn't count them accurately from this distance, but the herd looked modest. A dog of indeterminate breed and considerable age hauled itself upright from the porch and regarded her with deep suspicion. Cole Callahan came around from behind the barn before she had a chance to knock. He was carrying a piece of fence railing and was clearly in the middle of something, and he stopped when he saw her with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on something neutral. "Miss Navarro." "Mr. Callahan, I saw your notice at the hardware store." He looked at her for a moment, then at the fence rail in his hands, as if weighing several things at once. "The position I posted is for cooking and household work," he said. "It's temporary. The ranch isn't in a position to offer permanent work right now." "I understand that." "The pay is—" He named a figure. "It was fair. Not generous, but fair." "That's acceptable," she said. He shifted the fence rail to his other hand. He was looking at her with a kind of careful attention, like he was reading something and wasn't sure yet what it said. "You know people in town will talk," he said. "They'll draw conclusions." "People in town are already talking," Elena said. "Gerald Holt made sure of that. I don't think adding a legitimate job to the conversation makes things appreciably worse." Something moved through his expression. It might have been something close to wry, though it didn't get all the way there. "Fair enough," he said. Behind her, she heard the sound of the house door opening, and then Ruby Callahan appeared on the porch, still in her nightgown, though it was well past 8, her braid from yesterday now entirely abandoned in favor of hair that was simply doing whatever it wanted. "You came back," Ruby said, with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. "I came back," Elena agreed. Ruby looked at her father. Her father looked at Elena. The old dog had settled back down on the porch and appeared to be asleep. "You can start Monday," Cole Callahan said, "if you need a day to arrange your things in town." "Monday is fine," Elena said. She turned her horse around and rode back toward Iron Ridge, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead and tried to think practically about what the next weeks would require. She was careful not to think about anything beyond that. She had learned, the hard way, to keep her thinking small and specific when the larger picture was still too uncertain to look at directly. But somewhere in the back of her mind, less disciplined than the rest of her, something had shifted. Something small and cautious, like a plant that has been kept in the dark and is just now beginning to turn, without making a decision about it, toward whatever light it can find. She told Mrs. Dwyer she would be leaving at the end of the week. Mrs. Dwyer refunded one night's rate without being asked, which revised Elena's assessment of her upward considerably. Mrs. Cross caught her in the hallway before she could make it upstairs. "The Callahan Ranch," Mrs. Cross said. "That's where you're going?" "He needed household help. I need work." Mrs. Cross looked at her for a moment with those sharp old eyes. "He's a decent man," she said finally. "Lost more than most people know about, and he doesn't complain about it. His daughter seems to feel the same way." "That girl." Mrs. Cross said it with a complicated kind of fondness. 7 going on 45. She'll either run this territory someday or give her father 10 new gray hairs a week, possibly both. Elena almost smiled. Possibly both sounds about right. She went upstairs and packed properly this time, taking stock of what she had and what she would need and making a list, the way she always did when she was facing something she wasn't sure about. The list was her way of feeling like she had some footing, even when the ground was uncertain. She was still not sure about most of it. She was not sure what Cole Callahan was really like, beyond what one short conversation and a child's fond complaints could suggest. She was not sure how the town would receive her choice, or whether it would make the situation with Holt's rumors better or significantly worse. She was not sure she could do this, not in the sense of the practical skills required, but in the deeper sense of whether she had enough left in her for it. What she was sure about was that she was not going back to Boston, and that a job was a job, and that Ruby Callahan's eyes, looking at her from that porch, had something in them that she recognized. Need. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the plain patient variety, the kind that had stopped expecting too much, but hadn't stopped hoping entirely. Elena had looked like that once. She knew what it asked for and what it cost to give it. She folded her second dress and put it in the carpet bag. Outside the window, Iron Ridge was doing what it did every evening, settling into itself, lanterns coming on in windows, the sounds of the day beginning to quiet. A place that was still figuring out what it was, still in the process of becoming. She understood that feeling too. She arrived on a Monday, as agreed, with her carpet bag tied to the back of a hired horse she'd arranged for 2 days at a rate that left her wincing slightly at the arithmetic. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that feels deliberate, not the casual chill of autumn, but something with intention behind it, something that meant winter was not far off and was not going to apologize for that. Cole Callahan was already in the yard when she rode up, working on the fence section she'd seen him carrying the week before. He had it propped between 2 posts and was driving nails with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to waste as few motions as possible. He looked up when he heard the horse and gave her a nod that was brief but not unfriendly, and went back to the fence. "House is open," he said, without stopping what he was doing. "Ruby's inside. She's been up since 5. "Does she do that often?" "Often enough." He drove another nail. "There's coffee on the stove if it hasn't burned to the bottom yet. No promises." Elena dismounted and tied the horse and picked up her bag and went to the house. The dog on the porch lifted one eye open, judged her, and went back to sleep. She took that as a provisional acceptance. Inside, the house was warmer than the air outside suggested it had any right to be, which meant the wood stove was working properly, even if nothing else immediately announced itself as functional. The kitchen was the first room off the entrance, and it showed the accumulated effects of several weeks without consistent management. Not filthy exactly, but deeply disordered in the specific way that a space gets when the person responsible for it is doing their best but spread too thin to do it well. There were dishes stacked in a way that suggested they'd been washed but then put down wherever there was space. The table had a collection of items on it that had clearly been set there temporarily and then stayed. A bridle buckle, a folded newspaper from 3 weeks ago, a child's hair ribbon, 2 tallying sticks, and a mug with a crack in the handle that someone had kept anyway. Ruby was sitting on the floor next to the wood stove with a book open in her lap. Though she was not reading it, she was watching Elena with an expression of frank assessment. "Pa said you'd come back," she said. "I thought so too." "Here I am," Elena said. "He said not to bother you." "You're not bothering me." Ruby considered this. "He also said not to follow you around asking questions." "That seems like a reasonable request." "I'm just sitting here, though. That's not following." She paused. "I do have some questions. I'm just not asking them yet." Elena set her bag down near the door and looked at the kitchen. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at any disorganized space. Not with dismay, but with the practical eye of someone doing an inventory. What was here? What was missing? What needed to happen first? And what could wait? "Is there a list of what needs doing?" she asked. "Or did your father leave it to my judgment?" "Pa doesn't really make lists," Ruby said. "He keeps things in his head, but some of them fall out." She said this without criticism, just as a fact she had observed. "All right," Elena rolled up her sleeves. "Then we start with what's in front of us and work from there." She started with the kitchen because the kitchen was where you could get the fastest purchase on a disordered house. Once that room was functional, everything else was more manageable. She washed the dishes properly and put them away in the places that made most sense, reorganizing 2 shelves in the process because whoever had established the original system had apparently prioritized some logic she couldn't reconstruct. She wiped down the table and found homes for the items that had accumulated on it, setting the newspaper aside to ask Cole about, keeping the hair ribbon to return to Ruby, putting the bridle buckle near the door where it could be retrieved without coming back inside. Ruby watched all of this from her spot by the stove, no longer pretending to read. After a while, she started handing Elena things without being asked. The rag when Elena needed it, the bin when something needed to be thrown out. She did it quietly and without making a production of being helpful, which Elena found she appreciated more than enthusiastic help that required supervision. The coffee on the stove had not technically burned to the bottom, but it was approaching that condition with some commitment. Elena poured it out and made a fresh pot and found, in the process of looking for the coffee tin, 3 other things that needed attention in the pantry. A sack of flour with a small hole in the bottom corner that had been slowly spilling for days, a tin of lard with the lid not properly seated, and a jar of preserves that had lost its seal and needed to be used immediately or discarded. She fixed what could be fixed and flagged the rest. By mid-morning, she had a list of her own, a real list, written on the back of an envelope she found in the table drawer, of what the household needed in the way of supplies and what tasks needed to happen in what order. It wasn't comprehensive because she hadn't seen the whole house yet, but it was a start. Cole came in just before noon, smelling of cold air and sawdust, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the room for a moment, at the cleared table, the organized shelves, the fresh pot of coffee on the stove, and his expression did something complicated that he appeared to suppress fairly quickly. "The flour sack has a hole," Elena said. "You're losing about a tablespoon a day, which doesn't sound like much but adds up over a week. There's a tin of lard that needs to be used before it turns, and the jar of plum preserves on the second shelf should be used this week." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Baxter used to handle all of that?" "I figured. It looks like things have been managed as they came up rather than in advance. That's understandable when one person is doing everything." He took the coffee she handed him and sat down at the table in a way that suggested sitting down was something he hadn't done recently enough. "Is there anything else I should know?" "I'll know more once I've looked at the rest of the house, and I'll need to know your preferences. What Ruby will and won't eat, what time you want meals, whether you want me to make decisions independently about supplies or clear them with you first." Cole looked at his coffee. "Ruby will eat most things except turnips, which she maintains a philosophical objection to. Meals when the work allows it, 6 in the morning, noon if possible, 6 in the evening. And decisions," he stopped, "use your judgment. I don't need to be consulted on flour. Some employers do. I have enough things to make decisions about." He said it without complaint, just as a fact. "If you see something that needs doing, do it." She nodded. "One more thing." She set the envelope list on the table in front of him. "These are supplies the kitchen needs in the next week or 2. I don't know your budget constraints, so I've marked the urgent ones with a star." He looked at the list. He looked at it for longer than the length of it required. "You made this today." "It's the start. There's probably more." He folded the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll go to Mercer's on Thursday." He stood up, coffee half finished. "Thank you, Miss Navarro." He went back outside. Elena looked at the space where he'd been sitting and thought about the way he'd looked at that list. Not grateful exactly, or not only that. More like someone who had just put down something heavy and was surprised to find the absence of it. The first week was mostly logistics. Elena learned the house the way she learned most things. By moving through it systematically, noting what she found, building a picture from the parts. The downstairs was 2 main rooms, the kitchen and a sitting room that also served as Cole's office, with a scarred wooden desk in the corner buried under papers and ledgers, and what appeared to be about 4 months of unfiled correspondence. The upstairs had 3 rooms, Cole's, Ruby's, and a spare room that had been Mrs. Baxter's and was now hers. She did not go through Cole's desk. That was his domain, and she understood without needing to be told where the lines were. But she could see enough from the doorway to form some impressions, and what she saw suggested a man who was not careless with numbers, but was overwhelmed by the volume of them. There were invoices mixed in with what looked like land records. There were 2 different tallying systems that didn't appear to cross-reference each other. There was a calendar on the wall with dates marked in a cramped hand, and even from across the room she could see that several of the marks overlapped in a way that suggested scheduling conflicts he might not have noticed yet. She left it alone for now. She had enough to manage without walking into territory where she hadn't been invited. Ruby was her most consistent company during the day. The girl had a quality Elena recognized from certain children she'd known in Boston. the ones who had grown up in households where adult concerns were not kept carefully separate from children's awareness, who had as a result become preternaturally observant and self-sufficient and slightly more serious than children were supposed to be. Ruby made her own bed every morning without being told. She did her lessons. She was being taught by a woman in town 3 days a week, and on the other days she worked through her reader and her arithmetic on her own, with minimal supervision, asking questions when she had them, in a direct, unembarrassed way that Elena found easier to work with than either helplessness or false confidence would have been. She was also, as Mrs. Cross had suggested, watchful. She watched Elena in the way a child watches someone they have decided to evaluate seriously, not hostilely, but with attention, measuring the space between what people said and what they did. On Wednesday of the first week, Ruby appeared in the kitchen doorway while Elena was working through the pantry inventory and said, without preamble, "Do you like it here so far?" Elena thought about this honestly before answering. "It's hard to say after 4 days. I like the work." "Do you like us?" "I don't know you well enough yet to say anything meaningful about it," Elena said. "But so far, yes." Ruby seemed satisfied with this. Vague reassurances Elena was beginning to understand did not impress her. What she responded to was specificity. "Pa likes you," Ruby said. "How can you tell?" "He doesn't find reasons to leave the room when you're in it." She delivered this as a purely objective observation. With Mrs. Baxter, he used to find reasons. She talked a lot, and he doesn't really like a lot of talking. Elena turned back to the pantry. "I'll keep that in mind." "You don't talk a lot," Ruby observed. "You just say things when you have something to say. Pa does that too." "Does it bother you when people don't talk much?" Ruby considered. "No, I can tell what people are thinking without them saying it mostly. Talking sometimes just confuses what they're actually thinking." Elena looked at her. "You're 8 years old." 8.5, Ruby said. "Mrs. Callahan, my mother, she used to say I was born already having opinions. Pa says she wasn't wrong." She said it without flinching, her mother's name, the memory of her. There was something that moved across her face briefly. Not grief exactly, more like the acknowledgement of grief, the brief touch of a hand on something that would always be there. And then she moved on, the way children often could, back to the present moment with a resilience that adults tended to both admire and slightly misunderstand. "Were you close to her?" Elena asked carefully. "I was 6, Ruby said. "I remember some things really well and some things not well at all. I remember what her hands felt like. I don't really remember the sound of her voice anymore, and that bothers me sometimes." She paused. "Pa plays her music box sometimes at night when he thinks I'm asleep. It has a little song in it. I don't know if he plays it because it helps or because it doesn't." Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't land wrong. "Anyway," Ruby said with the particular briskness of someone changing direction on purpose, "are you going to make biscuits today? Mrs. Baxter made biscuits on Wednesdays." "I can make biscuits today," Elena said. "Good. Pa likes them better than cornbread, but he doesn't say so because cornbread is easier, so he feels bad making a preference known." Elena filed this away and started on the biscuits. The first sign of trouble came at the end of the second week. She had gone into town with the wagon for supplies, Cole's list plus her own, consolidated, and had managed most of the errands without incident when she ran into Margaret Holt at the Mercantile. She recognized her immediately as the woman in the dark coat from the station platform. Gerald Holt's sister, Mercer had mentioned once, without being asked. A woman who had lived in Iron Ridge her whole life and had opinions about most things in it. Margaret Holt was not openly rude. She was, in fact, very precisely not rude, which was almost worse. She acknowledged Elena with the particular brand of cool politeness that is designed to communicate exclusion without providing anything that can be directly objected to. "Miss Navarro," she said, "I heard you'd found a situation." "I did, yes." "At the Callahan Ranch." She said it neutrally, but the neutrality had texture. "That's right. Cole Callahan is a decent man." She was examining a bolt of fabric that she did not appear to actually need. "He's had a difficult time of it since his wife passed. It's good that he has help." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "Household help." Elena met her eyes. "Yes," she said. "That's what I provide." Something shifted in Margaret Holt's expression. a slight adjustment, the sense of having reached for something and not quite found it. "Of course," she said pleasantly, and turned back to the fabric. Mercer caught Elena's eye from behind the counter and gave her a very slight shake of his head, the kind that meant, "Leave it." She left it. She finished her shopping, loaded the wagon, and drove back to the ranch. And she turned the encounter over in her mind the way she turned over most things that bothered her, not with agitation, but with the methodical attention of someone cataloging what they know. Margaret Holt was going to be a problem. Not an unpredictable one. Elena could see the shape of the problem fairly clearly, but a problem that would require handling carefully because the woman had history in this town that Elena didn't, and reputation was a currency that accrued over decades, not weeks. She decided not to mention it to Cole. There was nothing he could do about it that wouldn't make it worse, and she wasn't in the habit of bringing problems to other people that she hadn't yet tried to solve herself. At the end of the second week, she looked at the desk in the sitting room and made a decision. She knocked on the sitting room door even though Cole wasn't in there. He was outside, she could hear him at the barn, because she wanted to establish the habit of treating the space as his before she entered it. She wasn't going to touch the desk. She was going to look at the calendar. The calendar showed what she'd suspected from the doorway. He had 2 supply deliveries scheduled for the same day next month. A bank appointment that appeared to overlap with something else she couldn't read from the notation, and at least 3 items that were simply marked with question marks, which she interpreted to mean he hadn't yet decided what to do about them. She left the calendar alone. She left the desk alone. She went back to the kitchen, and that evening, when Cole came in for supper, she waited until Ruby had eaten and gone upstairs before she said, "I noticed your calendar in the sitting room. I wasn't looking deliberately. I could see it from the door. You have 2 deliveries scheduled for the 19th of next month." Cole looked up from his plate. "Straw from the Benton farm and grain from Miller's feed, from what I could read," she said. "I don't know if that's a problem." He was quiet for a moment. "I forgot about the Benton delivery. I was thinking Miller's when I scheduled it." He rubbed the side of his face. "I'll need to send word to Benton to shift it to the 21st. Also," she stopped. "What?" "You're tallying. You have 2 systems that don't cross-reference each other. I don't know if that's intentional." He set down his fork. He looked at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately read. Not defensive, not resentful. Something more like the wariness of someone who has been managing a precarious system and isn't sure whether someone pointing at it is helpful or threatening. "I know it's not my place," she said. "You told me to use my judgment on household matters. The accounting is different." "It's not your place," he agreed. "But you're also not wrong about the tallying." He picked up his fork again. "My father set up one system. I added the other when the cattle operation expanded. I keep meaning to consolidate them." "I could do it," she said, "if you'd allow me to look at the books. I kept accounts for 4 years in Boston." Cole ate a bite of food. He ate another one. He appeared to be thinking about something that went beyond the immediate question. "Let me think about it," he said finally. She nodded and let it go. She had learned with certain kinds of people that offering something was enough and pressing it was too much. He brought the ledgers to her 3 days later. He set them on the kitchen table one morning while she was making breakfast and said, without ceremony, "The accounts from this year are in the brown one. The cattle tallies are in the other 2. I'd want to see whatever you come up with before anything changes." "Of course," she said. He nodded and went back outside. She opened the brown ledger first and spent the next hour learning the shape of the Callahan Ranch's finances. And what she found was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable either. The operation was solvent. Cole had managed that much. But it was running closer to the edge than it needed to be, and she could see 2 or 3 places where the accounting wasn't tracking costs accurately, which meant the picture he had of his own situation was slightly more optimistic than the actual situation warranted. She worked through it methodically, making notes on her envelope paper, not drawing conclusions yet, just mapping the territory. It took her 3 evenings of working after Ruby went to bed before she had a clear enough picture to say anything useful. When she presented it to Cole, she was careful about how she did it. She didn't come at it with the manner of someone who had found a problem. She came at it as information, laid out plainly, with the places where her reading might be wrong clearly acknowledged. Cole sat across the kitchen table from her and looked at the consolidated summary she'd made, and he was quiet for a long time. The difference in the cattle tally is from 2 years ago, he said finally. I thought I'd corrected it. You corrected it in the brown ledger, not the cattle tally. He rubbed his jaw. He looked at the number at the bottom of her summary. So the actual margin is narrower than what you were seeing, yes, but the margin is real. You're not in danger of losing the operation. You're just closer to the edge than you probably thought you were. He looked at the paper for a while longer. She waited. How would you fix it? He asked. I have some thoughts, but some of them involve decisions that are yours to make, not mine. Tell me the thoughts. So she did. She went through them one at a time, carefully, distinguishing between what was a straightforward correction and what was a judgment call that required his knowledge of the land and the stock and the market, things she didn't have. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he processed information. Not by talking back into it, but by holding it somewhere and working through it internally. When she finished, he said, The third option, on the summer grazing lease. Yes? You're right that the math works, but the Dornan family has the adjacent parcel and there's history there. It's not as simple as the lease document makes it look. I guess there might be something like that, which is why I flagged it as a decision for you. He nodded. He was looking at her with that unreadable look again, the one that contained more than it showed. You know, he said, Mrs. Baxter was very good. She kept this house running for 6 years, and I won't say otherwise. He paused. She didn't do this. The accounts? She didn't look. He tapped the paper. She managed what was in front of her. You went looking. Elena met his eyes. You told me to use my judgment. I did. He was quiet for a moment, then, I appreciate it, Miss Navarro. She gathered her papers. She was trying to assess the feeling of this conversation, not where it put her exactly, but what it meant. She had come here to do a job. She had done more than the job because the job, properly understood, encompassed more. That was all it was. She told herself that, with some conviction. The weeks moved through their rhythms. Cold mornings, the work of the household, Ruby's questions and observations, and the occasional crisis of small consequence, Cole's brief and plainly meant words at mealtimes, the slow accumulation of a routine. There were hard days. The week the water pump froze, and she and Ruby had to carry water from the creek for 3 days while Cole worked on the repair. Their arms aching by the second day, Ruby complaining with the precise vocabulary of someone who has decided to find the situation amusing rather than miserable. The day the milk cow went lame, and Cole spent most of the morning dealing with it, and came in at noon with his jaw set and his hands rougher than usual, and said nothing at all through lunch, and Elena did not attempt to fill the silence because she understood that some silences are doing necessary work. She also began to see the other thing, the thing that Ruby had been circling around in her careful, observant way since the first week. The ranch was managing, it was holding together, but it was doing so on the labor of one man who was also trying to raise a child, and the strain of that was written in the tight economy of Cole's movements, in the way he went to bed late and was up before dawn, in the slight delay before he answered questions that required him to shift gears between one problem and another. He didn't talk about it. She didn't think he talked about it to anyone. One evening in the third week, Ruby was supposed to be in bed but had come downstairs for water and discovered Elena at the kitchen table working through a reconciliation of the supply ledger. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown, watching. You do a lot of extra things, Ruby said. It needs doing. Pa hasn't said thank you enough. He says thank you. Not enough, Ruby said with authority. He doesn't always know how to say things on the outside that he's thinking on the inside. Mama used to say he was like a book with a very plain cover that had a really interesting story in it, and you had to actually read it to know. Elena looked at the girl in the doorway, small and serious and a little tired, standing in the glow of the lantern light. You miss her very much, Elena said. Ruby was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. But I also think... She stopped, started again. I think maybe she'd want Pa to be okay. And he's not quite okay yet. He's better than he was, I think, but not quite. She went back upstairs without saying anything else, her bare feet quiet on the steps. Elena sat with that for a while. Then she went back to the ledger, because that was what needed doing. Outside, the Wyoming night was very cold and very quiet. and the ranch made the small sounds that buildings make when th're settling into the dark. The creak of timber, the sigh of wind against the eaves, the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the pasture. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that was still, in its complicated and imperfect way, alive. She was still at the table when the lantern burned low. She trimmed it and kept working, and did not let herself think about anything that was further ahead than the next column of numbers. November came in hard that year, the way Wyoming winters often did. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door being thrown open onto something vast and indifferent. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night during the first week of the month, and Elena woke to find ice on the inside of her window glass, and Ruby standing in her doorway, already fully dressed, reporting that the water in the kitchen basin had a skim of frost on it and that she'd stoked the wood stove but wasn't sure she'd done it right. She'd done it right. Elena checked, found the fire drawing properly, and started the morning from there. The cold changed the rhythm of the ranch in ways she was still learning to read. Cole was up even earlier than usual, out before dawn to check on the cattle, making sure the stock tank hadn't frozen solid overnight, moving through the dark with the particular purposefulness of someone who had done this enough times to stop finding it remarkable. He came in for breakfast with his hands red from the cold, and his face carrying the expression of a man running calculations he didn't particularly like the results of. 2 of the heifers were against the fence in the south pasture, he said, pulling off his coat. They drift that direction when the wind's from the north. I need to move them before it gets worse. How bad does it get? Elena asked. Here? He considered. Bad enough. He looked at the window. This is early, though. Usually we get another 2 or 3 weeks of workable weather before it locks in properly. She put food on the table. Ruby had already seated herself and was eating with efficiency, because Ruby had also noticed that on cold mornings the pace of the household shifted and adapted accordingly. Mrs. Callahan, Ruby started. I'm not Mrs. Callahan, Elena said automatically, for perhaps the 4th time. I know, Ruby said. I just forget. What I was going to say is, can we make the big soup today? The one with the dried beans and the ham bone. If there's a ham bone. There's one from last week. I saved it. It's in the cold box. Elena looked at her. You planned ahead. Ruby looked back with the expression of someone who considers planning ahead simply to be good sense. It's cold. Soup makes sense when it's cold. Cole was watching this exchange with something in his face that wasn't quite a smile and never quite got there with him, but occupied the same general territory. The soup went on mid-morning, and the smell of it moved through the house all day like something solid, and that evening Cole ate 2 bowls of it and said it was good, which from him constituted something close to enthusiasm. These were the rhythms Elena had come to understand, the small acknowledgments that stood in for larger ones, the specific words chosen because they were true rather than because they were warm, the way Ruby functioned as a kind of interpreter between her father's interior landscape and the world outside it. It was not the household she would have designed if given the choice, but it was real. It had weight. It was nothing like the 2 years she had spent on Tilton Street, where everything had the quality of a transaction and no one left more than they had to. She had not let herself think too carefully about that distinction. It felt dangerous in a way she didn't fully trust herself to navigate. The talk started, properly started, the kind with structure and repetition behind it rather than just idle wondering, sometime around the 3rd week of November. She knew because Mercer told her. He was the most honest source of information she had found in Iron Ridge, not because he was a gossip, but because he was the kind of man who believed that people deserved to know when things were being said about them. He told her plainly, while she was at the counter tallying her supply list, that Margaret Holt had been speaking to people. What's she saying? Elena asked. That the arrangement at the Callahan Ranch isn't what it appears. He kept his voice low, though the store was empty except for the 2 of them. She's not specific. She doesn't have to be. She just asks questions. Have you heard how long Miss Navarro plans to stay? That kind of thing. Elena looked at her list. And what do people say? Depends on the person. Some of them don't think much of it. Some of them... He paused. You have to understand that Cole Callahan has been alone out there for 2 years. People have been watching to see what he does. Some of them don't want to see him do wrong. He hasn't done wrong, Elena said flatly. I know that. And so do most sensible people. He set her supplies on the counter. But sensible people don't always speak the loudest. She drove back to the ranch and thought about it on the road, which gave her time to arrive at something that felt like a considered position rather than a reaction. The considered position was she could not control what Margaret Holt said. She could control what was actually true of the situation, which was that she was doing her job and doing it honestly. And the only thing that would be damaged by rumors was other people's opinions, which was their problem and not hers to manage. She believed that. She also knew from experience that believing a thing didn't fully insulate you from the cost of it. She had not told Cole. She kept weighing whether she should and kept arriving at the same answer. Not yet. Not until there was something specific to respond to. Worrying him about something vague and not yet consequential seemed like a bad use of what trust they had built, which was real, but still careful, still finding its footing. The thing that made it consequential happened on a Thursday in early December. Cole had gone into town for a bank appointment, one she had helped him prepare for, consolidating the accounts into a clear summary that showed the ranch's actual position rather than the muddier picture the old system had produced. He was gone longer than expected, and he came back in the early evening with his jaw set in the particular way that meant something had gone sideways. He came through the door, nodded at Elena without quite meeting her eyes, and went directly to the sitting room. She heard the desk drawer open, heard it close, heard silence. Ruby, sitting by the stove with her reader, looked at Elena. Elena looked at the pot on the stove. She dished up Ruby's supper and sent her upstairs with it. Ruby went without argument, which was itself a kind of communication, and then she knocked on the sitting room door. "Come in." He was standing at the window, not at the desk. His hat was still on, which she had come to understand meant the serious part of something hadn't ended yet. "Bad meeting?" she asked. He turned from the window. "Douglas at the bank told me something." He stopped, looked at her with those gray eyes that were direct when he chose to use them directly. "He said there have been questions raised about the management of my affairs. From someone who apparently told him that my household situation was—" He said the next words with precision, the way you repeat something you found offensive. "A cause for concern among people who care about this community." Elena stood still. Margaret Holt. She didn't go to Douglas herself, but Douglas knows who talks to whom. He looked at his hat, then took it off and set it on the desk. "She's suggesting that my judgment can't be trusted, that employing you is evidence of something." He didn't say what the something was. He didn't need to. "I see," Elena said. "Douglas isn't going to act on it. He's a reasonable man, and he told her so. But it went on his record of the conversation, and the fact that it was said—" Cole rubbed the back of his neck. "It was said. That doesn't go away." "No?" she said. "It doesn't." There was quiet between them. The fire cracked in the sitting room hearth. Outside, the wind had come up. "I want to tell you something," Cole said. He was speaking carefully in the way that meant he had thought about this on the road home, had chosen the words. "What she's saying is wrong. What you've done here, the work, the accounts, all of it, it's been more than I expected, and I don't take it lightly. That's one thing." He paused. "The other thing is that I understand if this changes your situation. If the talk makes it impossible for you to stay." Elena looked at him. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." The word came out quickly, more quickly than he probably intended. "No, I'm saying I'd understand if you felt you needed to." "I don't need to," she said. "I'm not going to be moved off a position I'm in legally and honestly because Gerald Holt's sister has too much time and too little goodwill. That's not how I operate." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the sense of having suspected something and having it confirmed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went back to the kitchen and finished the supper dishes and did not let her hands shake, which required some effort. What she hadn't anticipated was Ruby. She came downstairs the following Saturday and found Cole's coat was gone and the horse tied in the yard, which meant he'd come back from somewhere rather than left for it. He came in through the back door a few minutes later with his boots heavy with mud and his expression carrying something she couldn't place. Not the tight jaw of last Thursday, but something more open, more uncertain. "I went to see Dornan," he said. Elena looked up from the bread she was working. "The neighbor, with the land adjacent to the summer grazing pasture. He pulled off his coat. You'd flagged the lease arrangement in the accounts as a possible cost-saving option. I told you there was history. I remember. I went to talk to him. He sat down at the table without being invited to, which was not something he normally did when she was working. We haven't spoken properly in 4 years. There was a dispute about a fence line when his cattle got through and damaged some of my grazing. It went badly. Neither of us handled it well. She kept working the bread. What happened when you went today? He was surprised to see me. We stood in his yard for about 10 minutes being careful with each other, and then his wife came out and told us both to stop being idiots and come inside. A pause. She's a direct woman. Did it help? Going? We didn't settle everything, but we talked. He looked at his hands on the table. He said He said he'd heard I was having trouble with some people in town, over the arrangement here. He glanced up. Word gets to people even 4 miles out. I know. He said... Cole stopped, started again. He said a man who can overlook that kind of pressure to keep someone worth keeping is a man with a good head on his shoulders, or words roughly to that effect. Dornan doesn't exactly speak in paragraphs. Elena stood at the table with her hands in the bread dough and looked at him. At this man she had known for 6 weeks, who kept things in his chest that other men wore on their sleeves, who had gone 4 miles in December mud to make peace with a neighbor partly because she'd flagged a line item in a ledger. She felt something that she immediately applied pressure to, the way you apply pressure to a wound. That was generous of him, she said. It was honest, Cole said, which was his way of distinguishing between the two. December deepened and the cold became a permanent condition rather than a weather event. Elena settled into the longer rhythms of winter work, the heavier cooking, the maintenance of warmth throughout the house, the particular challenge of keeping Ruby occupied and engaged when the outdoors was largely unavailable. Ruby turned out to have opinions about needlework. Pointless, she said, unless the needle was doing something useful. Reading, good. Arithmetic, acceptable. And drawing, acceptable if she was drawing things she chose rather than things assigned. She had a sketchbook she'd been given at some point and kept it under her bed, and she showed it to Elena one afternoon without making much of it, just handed it over as if it were no particular thing. Elena looked through it. There were horses, many horses, drawn with the kind of careful attention that comes from really looking at something rather than just the idea of it. There were pictures of the house from outside, from different angles. There were pictures of the old dog, who had been named, Elena had recently learned, Theodore. There was a picture of Cole from behind, sitting at the desk in the sitting room, his shoulders in that particular posture of focused concentration. And there, near the back of the book, a careful drawing of Elena at the kitchen table, bent over the ledger, one hand holding the pen and the other holding the page flat. The light in the drawing came from the lantern, and Ruby had gotten the shadow right. The way it fell across the tabletop, the way it made the edge of Elena's profile something between dark and light. She looked at it for a long moment. That's a good drawing, she said. I did it from memory, Ruby said. You do that a lot. Sit at the table at night after I go up. I've seen you when I come down for water sometimes. She paused. You look like you're trying to solve something. I usually am. Do you solve it? Sometimes. Elena handed the sketchbook back. You have a real eye for proportion. Where did you learn to draw like this? Mama, Ruby said. She drew too. Pa still has some of hers. She tucked the sketchbook under her arm. He keeps them in the chest in his room. He doesn't look at them, but he keeps them. Elena said nothing. I think, Ruby said slowly, working through a thought as she spoke, that some people hold on to things not because they want to feel sad, but because they don't know how to put them down properly yet, like they're still figuring out the right place to set them. She went upstairs with her sketchbook, leaving Elena standing in the kitchen with that sentence occupying more space than a sentence from an 8-year-old should reasonably occupy. The crisis came in the middle of December, on a night when the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind came up from the northwest with the kind of purpose that made even the most experienced ranchers pay attention. Cole came in at 10 in the evening. Elena heard him on the stairs when she was still up, working, and then came back down again almost immediately. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. There's a problem in the south pasture, he said. His voice was level, but she could hear the controlled urgency under it. The fence section I repaired in November. The wind's taken down part of it, and 3 head are out. I need to go. In this? I don't have a choice. If they drift far enough in this cold, he didn't finish, but he didn't need to. He was already pulling his coat back on. Elena looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, the efficiency of his movements. She thought about the fence line, about 3 cattle in the dark in a temperature that was still dropping. Take the lantern from the kitchen, she said. The barn one will be harder to carry on horseback, and there's rope on the 3rd peg by the back door. I saw you put it there yesterday. He stopped, looked at her. You noticed that. I notice most things. He took the lantern and the rope. He was at the door when she said, I'll keep the stove going and have something hot when you come back. He turned. There was a moment, brief, not made into more than it was, where he looked at her with something direct in his eyes that had nothing to do with the fence or the cattle or the cold. Thank you, Elena, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She had been Miss Navarro for 6 weeks. She heard his horse go out into the dark, and she put more wood on the fire and made a pot of strong coffee and kept herself busy with the morning's bread preparation, because there was nothing else to do with the next 2 hours except fill them with something productive. He came back at midnight, frozen through, with all 3 cattle accounted for and the fence section temporarily braced with wire he'd found in the pasture. A permanent repair would have to wait for daylight. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and for a few minutes said nothing at all, just let the warmth work on him. Elena put food in front of him. He ate it. The oldest of the 3, he said finally, had gotten herself through a stand of scrub pine in the dark and couldn't figure out how to get back the way she'd come. She was just standing there, braced against the wind. He shook his head slightly. Cattle aren't stupid, exactly, but they make interesting decisions. Are they all right? Fine. Cold and unhappy, which is a fair reaction. He looked at his coffee. I'll fix the fence properly tomorrow. He paused. I wouldn't have remembered about the rope if you hadn't said it. The pasture rope's where I always keep it. I wasn't thinking straight when I went out. You were moving fast, she said. That's what needs to happen sometimes. He looked at her across the table. The lantern between them made the light small and warm in particular, and the wind outside was doing what it did, and the house held against it in the way old houses do. Not perfectly, but well enough. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. When you came here, he was choosing his words slowly. It was because you needed work, and this was what was available. That's the straightforward version. Yes, but you've... He stopped. Tried again. What you've done here isn't what I posted that notice for. The accounting, the way you look at the whole thing, the way you... Another stop. He set down his coffee. The way you are with Ruby. Elena waited. She could feel the direction of this, like feeling a wind shift before you can say what direction it's now coming from. She talks to you, he said. She hasn't talked to anyone the way she talks to you since her mother. He said it plainly, without apparent difficulty, though she knew it cost him something. I know I'm not always what she needs. I know I'm not always present the way I should be. I'm trying, but I'm aware that trying and doing aren't the same thing. You're doing better than you give yourself credit for, Elena said. Maybe. He looked at his hands. The point I'm working toward... He almost seemed to find something wry in his own difficulty with this. I'm not good at making points when they matter. Take your time. I don't want this to be temporary, he said. She was very still. The position, he added, and then seemed to realize that didn't fully cover what he'd meant to say. That too. But I mean... He looked at her. I mean all of it. I mean, I don't want you to be a person who was here for a while and then wasn't. Outside, the wind pushed at the house. The fire in the stove made its sounds. Cole, she said carefully. I know it's too soon, he said. I know we've known each other 6 weeks, and I know what it sounds like, and I know about the talk in town, and I know you came here because you needed work, and not because... He stopped. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm telling you where I am, so you know. Because I think you should know where people are, rather than have to guess at it. Elena looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she had catalogued carefully for 6 weeks, whose silences she had learned to read, whose daughter had drawn her in a sketchbook from memory. This man who went out in the dark in a Wyoming winter for 3 cattle and came back and said what he meant with the particular difficulty of someone who was not practiced at it, but was committed to the attempt. She thought about Boston and the room on Tilton Street and the cold arithmetic of a life that had been asking permission for too long. She thought about Gerald Holt on the train platform and the way she had walked away from him and not looked back and had felt, beneath the humiliation, something that might have been the beginning of resolve. She thought about what she had built in 6 weeks in this house, not just the ordered kitchen and the consolidated accounts and the warm meals, but something else, something that didn't have an entry in any ledger. "I hear you," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. It wasn't all he was asking, they both knew that, but it was the honest shape of the conversation at that hour, in that cold, and neither of them pushed it further than it needed to go that night. He went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for another hour, not working, just sitting with the fire and the wind and the very specific feeling of a life that was in the process of becoming something she hadn't planned on. She was frightened by it. She was also, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, possibly in years, possibly longer, something that she recognized slowly as the sensation of not wanting to leave. 2 days later, he asked her properly. Not at midnight over coffee, not in the worn-down aftermath of a weather emergency, but in the afternoon in the yard, where he'd found her splitting kindling because the kitchen supply was low and he'd been too occupied to get to it. He appeared around the side of the house and stopped when he saw what she was doing, and something crossed his face quickly. "You don't need to do that," he said. "It needed doing," she said, setting up the next piece. "Elena." He said her name with the same careful weight he'd used at midnight. "Stop for a second." She set down the axe and looked at him. The winter light was flat and cold, and it made everything look very clear, very specific. The bare cottonwoods along the fence line, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air, the look on his face. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, not as help, as he made a short, frustrated gesture. "I'm not going to make this into something poetic because it won't come out that way. I want you to marry me. I want Ruby to have what she needs, and I think you should know that I don't say things I don't mean." Elena stood in the yard. The cold was a physical fact all around her. "I know you don't," she said. "I know it's not. This isn't what you came here for." "No," she said. "It isn't." He waited. She looked at the house that needed paint, with the porch step that still needed fixing, and the chimney that drew slightly off-center and produced more smoke on a still day than it should. The house where Ruby's sketchbook lived under a bed and Theodore the dog slept his old dog sleep on the porch, and the ledgers in the sitting room now told a true story instead of a convenient one. "It's also," she said slowly, "not something I'm going to say no to." He stood in the flat winter light and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "All right, that's your response?" "I didn't want to say anything that would take away from it," he said. Despite everything, she almost smiled. "I have conditions. Tell me. I'm not an ornament. I won't be managed or kept quiet. If I see something in the accounts or the operation that needs saying, I say it. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. And Ruby," she paused, "I care about her. I want you to know that what I feel for her isn't part of any arrangement or obligation. It's just real." Cole looked at her with those gray eyes and said quietly, "I know that. She knows it too. Kids like her always know." The wind picked up slightly, coming from the north again. Elena picked up the axe. "I'll finish the kindling," she said. "Supper needs to be at 6. He stood there for another moment, and she could feel him almost saying something else, and then deciding against it, the way people decide against things when what's already been said is sufficient. He went back to work. She went back to work. And somewhere in the house, she would later discover, Ruby was sitting at the top of the stairs with her sketchbook in her lap, having heard enough of the yard through the partially open window to understand the shape of what had happened, and she was drawing. Not anything in particular, just moving the pencil, the way people do when they feel something too large for stillness. The news moved through Iron Ridge the way all news moved through Iron Ridge, faster than it had any right to, carried on the particular current that flows between people who have known each other long enough to have opinions about each other's business. By the time Cole went into town to file the necessary paperwork at the county clerk's office, the clerk already knew why he was there before he opened his mouth. "Heard congratulations are in order," the clerk said. He was a careful man named Aldous Fitch, who had worked in that office for 15 years and had witnessed, in that time, the full range of human decisions and their consequences. He said it without editorial comment, which Elena would have appreciated if she'd been there. Cole looked at him. "Thank you, Aldous." "Margaret Holt was in here yesterday," Fitch said, shuffling papers with the focused attention of a man who is conveying information while maintaining plausible neutrality. "She had questions about the filing requirements for, well, various things." "Did she?" "She did." He set the papers down. "I told her the requirements are the requirements, same for everyone." He looked at Cole directly. "Which is true." "I know it is." Fitch stamped the form. "She's going to make some noise, Cole." "I expect so." "Some people will listen to her." "Some people always do." Cole took the stamped form and folded it and put it in his coat. "Thank you, Aldous." He drove back to the ranch and told Elena what Fitch had said, in the same plainly factual way he told her most things. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Ruby having gone upstairs, and Elena listened without interrupting and then sat with it for a moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to go about our business," he said. "Same as before." "That's what I want too." She looked at her coffee. "But I think we should be prepared for the fact that going about our business is going to require more active effort than it sounds like." "Meaning what?" "Meaning Margaret Holt isn't going to limit herself to the clerk's office." Elena had been thinking about this since the day Cole had come back from the bank, since the conversation where she'd understood what they were actually dealing with. She has a position in this town. She's been here her whole life. She has the kind of standing that takes years to build, and she knows how to use it. She paused. She's also, I think, genuinely convinced she's protecting something. That makes her more difficult to manage than someone who knows they're being petty. Cole was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this. It's the kind of problem that benefits from thinking about." "What's the approach then, according to your thinking?" Elena considered. "We don't fight it directly. There's nothing to fight. She hasn't said anything actionable, just implications. You can't argue with an implication without making it look like you're confirming it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What we can do is give people something real to look at instead. The ranch's performance. The actual condition of things. People who are on the fence, who aren't convinced by Margaret one way or the other, they'll make up their minds by what they see. And the ones who are already convinced by her? Those we probably can't move, but they're not the whole town." She met his eyes. "And people who are looking for a reason to change their minds will find one if you give it to them." He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that meant he was taking something seriously. "You've done this before," he said. "Talked through a problem like this. I've had to think carefully about my position in situations where other people's opinion of me mattered more than it should have," she said. "That's different from being strategic, but it teaches you some of the same things." He nodded. He didn't offer sympathy about that, which she appreciated. Sympathy about the past was less useful than practical thinking about the present. "All right," he said. "We go about our business." Moz. They were married in the first week of January at the county courthouse, with Aldous Fitch as a witness and Mercer from the Mercantile as the second, because Elena had asked Mercer, and he had said yes without hesitation, and then cleared his throat and said it was the decent thing, and that was all he'd say about it. Ruby wore her best dress and stood very straight and held Elena's hand throughout, not because she was nervous. She had explained beforehand that she was not nervous, but because, she said, it seemed like the right place for her hand to be. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a warm day. The room at the courthouse where such things were conducted had a window with a cracked pane that someone had patched with paper, and the judge who performed the service had a cold that made him sound as though he were officiating from the bottom of a well. None of it was what Elena might have imagined once, long ago, when she'd been young enough to imagine such things with any conviction. It was real, though. That was what it had instead. Afterward, Mercer produced a small bottle of decent whiskey and poured 4 glasses, 3 full ones and a half glass for Ruby, which Ruby accepted with great seriousness and then grimaced at, which broke the solemnity of the moment entirely. Cole put his arm around Elena's shoulders with the slightly careful quality of a man who is doing something he means but is still learning the mechanics of, and she leaned into it by about half an inch, which was what the moment called for. They drove back to the ranch in the cold January light, and that was that. The first direct confrontation came 3 weeks later in Mercer's store. Elena was there for the weekly supplies, Ruby with her because Ruby had been promised she could choose a new hair ribbon, which had been negotiated over breakfast with the seriousness of a treaty discussion. They were working through the list when the door opened and Margaret Holt came in, accompanied by a woman named Helen Partridge, who was the wife of the town's most prominent attorney, and who moved through social situations with the careful positioning of someone who understood that being seen with the right people mattered. There was a moment when Margaret saw Elena and made the calculation that Elena could see her making, whether to leave, whether to say nothing, whether to speak. She chose to speak. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. She gave the name a very precise weight, neither warm nor openly cold. "I heard the news." Elena turned. Mrs. Holt. Ruby, who had been examining hair ribbons at the far end of the counter, looked up with the alert attention of a child who has learned to monitor the temperature of adult conversations. "I hope you'll be very happy," Margaret said. She said it with the specific cadence of someone who is saying a social formula, and not much more than that. "Thank you," Elena said. There was a pause. Elena went back to her list. She was aware that this was not the move Margaret was expecting. Most people, when faced with that kind of pointed pleasantry, either deflected anxiously or over-explained themselves. Elena did neither. She looked at her list and asked Mercer for the next item. Helen Partridge made a small sound that was almost certainly not intentional. Margaret tried again. "It must have been a quick decision. You hadn't been in Iron Ridge long." "Long enough," Elena said. She didn't look up. Cole Callahan is a man who's had a difficult few years. People worry about him making decisions under a pause. Difficult circumstances. Elena set her list down on the counter. She turned and looked at Margaret Holt fully, not with hostility. She had thought about this kind of moment, and she had decided that hostility would be the wrong instrument for it. What she used instead was simple directness. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "I understand you have concerns. I imagine they come from a genuine place. But what I'd ask you to consider is whether the story you've assembled about this situation is actually based on what you've observed or on what you expected to find when you started looking." She paused. "The ranch accounts are in better order than they've been in several years. Cole is managing his operation more effectively than at any point since I arrived. His daughter is well and happy. If those are the results of poor judgment, I'm not sure what good judgment would look like." Margaret's expression had gone through several things during this. It had not gone to any of them far enough to be rude. "I'm sure that's all true," she said, with a precision that conceded the factual point while declining to concede anything larger. "I know it is," Elena said, "because I was the one who did most of it." She turned back to Mercer. "The flour, the sugar, and the salt. And Ruby?" She looked at the end of the counter. "Have you decided on a ribbon?" Ruby, who had been watching the whole exchange with the total stillness of someone who has understood the importance of not breaking someone's concentration at a critical moment, held up a green ribbon. "This one." "Good choice," Elena said. Helen Partridge, she noticed on the way out, was looking at her with an expression that had shifted from the practiced neutrality she'd come in with to something more like reassessment. She told Cole about it that evening because she had decided early on that they would not manage things separately when managing them together was possible. He listened from across the kitchen table and then said, "How did she react?" At the end. "She maintained her position, but she'd expected me to be defensive, and I wasn't, so she didn't get the purchase she was looking for." Helen Partridge was there? Yes, he considered this. Her husband is on the county board. He's a man who reads a room carefully and moves toward where he thinks the weight is going to fall. He paused. Helen's opinion shapes his, more than he'd admit. I thought it might mean something that she was there. It does. He was quiet for a moment. You handled it well. I was very rude, Elena said. You were completely polite. I was polite in a way that was very rude, she said. There's a difference. Something moved through his expression. He almost got there this time, almost arrived at the smile. I'll take your word for it. February brought the first real test of the ranch, and it had nothing to do with Margaret Holt. There was a cold snap that lasted 11 days, a sustained freeze that came down from the north and stayed, And during that stretch, they lost 4 head of cattle to exposure in the northeast pasture, where the shelter broke and couldn't be repaired fast enough in the conditions. Cole worked for 3 days with barely any sleep, and Elena kept the house running in the particular way that a house needs to be kept during a sustained crisis. The fires, the food, the logistics of getting things from one place to another in temperatures that made every task take twice as long, Ruby managing herself with a self-sufficiency that Elena made note of and would revisit later. On the 4th night, Cole came in at midnight and sat at the kitchen table and said, "4 head. I should have checked the northeast shelter earlier in the month." Elena put coffee in front of him. She sat across from him. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it to be hard on you," she said. "I'm saying it because I think you know it, and you're waiting for someone to either confirm it or argue with it, and arguing would be the wrong call." She put her hands around her own mug. "The shelter was on the list I made in November. I should have followed up on whether it got done." "That's not your—" "I had the list," she said. "I made it, and then I moved to other things. That's on me as much as on you." He was quiet. She watched him absorb this. The idea that the loss was distributable, that it didn't belong entirely to him. It was not easy for him. She had noticed over the months that he had a deep habit of holding failure as a personal rather than a circumstantial thing, and she suspected this had served him in some ways and cost him considerably in others. "4 head," he said again. "Will it affect the spring figures significantly? It tightens things." He rubbed his face. "Not catastrophically, but tighter than I wanted." "Then we work with tighter." She said it simply, as a fact. "You know the operation. What adjusts easiest?" They spent the next hour at the kitchen table going through it, not despairing. There wasn't room for it, and Elena was not inclined to despair as a general orientation, but working, thinking through what the spring would require and what it wouldn't and where the margin could be found. Cole knew the land and the cattle and the market rhythms better than she did. She knew the numbers and the patterns they made. Between those two things, there was enough to work with. By 1 in the morning, they had something that functioned as a plan. Not a comfortable plan, but a real one. "How do you do that?" Cole said when they were done. He wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at her. "Do what?" "Stay level. When things go wrong." Elena thought about this. "I've been in situations where panicking made things worse, and I learned the lesson." She paused. "Also, I'm not always as level as I look. I just finish the feeling before I deal with the problem." "You finish the feeling." "I let it be there, do what it needs to do, and then I put it somewhere that isn't in the way of the work." She considered. "It's not the same as not feeling it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know how to do that." "I know. Is it something that can be learned?" "I think so," she said. "I don't think I was born knowing it." He nodded slowly, and she had the sense of something being considered and filed for later, which was how he processed most things that mattered to him. March came, and with it a shift that Elena noticed before she could have explained how. It started small. Mercer's wife, a quiet woman named Agnes, who had always been pleasant without being particularly warm, stopped Elena on the street one afternoon and said she'd heard from one of the ranching families east of town that the Callahan operation had come through the winter cold snap better than expected. "Cole's always been reliable," she said, "but this spring he seems different, steadier." She paused. "I imagine that's not unrelated to you." Elena said thank you and meant it, because Agnes had said it simply, without apparatus or agenda. Then there was Mrs. Dornan, the direct woman from the neighboring ranch whose intervention had helped break 4 years of silence between Cole and her husband, who appeared at the ranch one afternoon in early March with a wrapped package of smoked sausage that she said was from the last of their winter slaughter and that she had too much of. She sat in Elena's kitchen and drank coffee and talked for the better part of an hour about practical things, the spring planting, the cattle prices that were expected to come up from the south later in the season, the state of the road between the two ranches, which had been bad since November and showed no signs of improving. She didn't mention Margaret Holt. She didn't mention the talk. She mentioned the road and the cattle prices and the fact that her husband and Cole had renegotiated the summer grazing arrangement and that she thought it was a better deal than the one they'd had before, which was the most direct acknowledgement Elena had received from anyone outside the household that the work she had done on the accounts had produced a result that mattered in the actual world. "You're good for him," Mrs. Dornan said at the door as she was leaving. She said it in the same tone she'd used to talk about the road. Direct, observational, not sentimental. He was running this place like a man waiting for something to go wrong. Now he's running it like a man who's actually here. She left before Elena could respond, which was probably just as well. Buckle. The moment with Gerald Holt came in April. She had been expecting something, some direct encounter, some acknowledgement of what existed between the original situation and the current one. What she had not expected was the particular form it took. She was at the post office when he came in. Iron Ridge's post office was a small room off the back of the General Notions store, barely large enough for the counter and the rows of wooden letter boxes. And there was no graceful way for two people who did not want to encounter each other to avoid each other in it. He saw her. She saw him. There was a moment of the particular suspension that happens when two people are calculating their options simultaneously. Gerald Holt looked older than he had on the train platform in October, which was not surprising. Winter in Wyoming aged people, and he had not, from what she had gathered in the months since, had an easy one. His ranch had gone through the cold snap in worse shape than the Callahan operation. He had a quieter manner than she remembered, though that might have been the confined space. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mr. Holt." He took his mail from the postmaster without looking at it. He seemed to be deciding something. "I heard about the Northeast Pasture Shelter," he said finally. "In the cold snap. That you and Cole worked through the loss well." She looked at him. She was trying to read the register of this, whether it was conciliatory or informational or something else. "We managed," she said. He nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I said some things. In October. About the circumstances of your arrival." He stopped. "Mrs. Baxter told my sister that the ledgers at the Callahan Ranch are in better order than they've been since Cole's father ran the place." He seemed to be finding this difficult, and not pretending otherwise. "I made a judgment that I didn't have the basis for. I want you to know I understand that." Elena stood in the small room with her letters in her hand. She thought about October, the platform, the cold morning, the envelope he'd held out to her that she had not taken. The humiliation of it, the specific weight of standing in front of people while being told you were the wrong kind of person. She had put that feeling somewhere, the way she put all the difficult feelings, in the place that was not in the way of the work. She had not forgotten it. She had just learned to keep it separate from what she did next. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. It was not a full forgiveness. She didn't think he was expecting one, and she wasn't going to offer what wasn't there yet simply because the moment seemed to call for it. But it was an honest response, and he seemed to take it for what it was. He left first. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, looking at her letters without reading them, feeling something she couldn't easily name. Not satisfaction, not exactly, but something more like the quiet click of a thing fitting into its proper place. By May, the ranch was into the spring work in earnest, and the difference a functional accounting system made was real in the specific, undramatic way that practical improvements usually were. Cole knew what he had to work with before he made decisions, rather than after. He knew where the tight places were and could plan around them instead of discovering them mid-season. He had renegotiated 2 supplier arrangements, with Mercer's help, who had more leverage in those conversations than a single rancher, and brought his supply costs down by an amount that wasn't transformative but was meaningful. The summer grazing arrangement with Dornan proved to be what Elena had suggested it could be, less expensive than the previous lease, structured differently in a way that actually matched how Cole used the land. Dornan himself appeared at the ranch twice in May for conversations that had the character of 2 men who had discovered, belatedly, that they had adjacent interests and should perhaps have been talking years ago. Ruby observed all of this from her various vantage points, the stairs, the kitchen doorway, the window seat in the sitting room, with the same watchful attention she applied to everything. She was 9 now, having had her birthday in March, and Elena had made her a cake with the dried apple filling that Ruby had apparently declared, unprompted, was her favorite thing for a cake, a preference she shared as pure information rather than as a hint. Elena had noted the information and produced the cake, and Ruby had eaten a piece and a half and pronounced it exactly right, which Elena had learned was the highest available designation. She was doing better at school. Her teacher, the woman in town named Miss Albright, had sent a note home in April saying that Ruby's reading had improved significantly and that she appeared more settled than she had been the previous year. Cole read the note twice and put it in the desk drawer, which Elena understood to mean he was keeping it. One afternoon in late May, Elena found Ruby in the kitchen drawing at the table. This was not unusual. Ruby drew everywhere. But when Elena leaned over to look at what she was working on, she found it was a drawing of the house, done from the outside, with careful attention to the new paint on the porch. They had painted in April, Cole and Elena working 2 Saturdays on it, while Ruby handed them things and argued about color. And the repaired porch step, and the window boxes that Elena had put in with some leftover lumber from the fence repair. "It looks different from last year," Ruby said, without looking up. "Most things do," Elena said. "Theodore's the same," Ruby said. Theodore the old dog was, in fact, perhaps the single constant in the landscape of change, his ambitions extending no further than his spot on the porch. "But most other things are different." She added a detail to the chimney. "Better different, mostly." "Mostly?" Ruby considered. "I still miss her. That's not different." She said it with the matter-of-factness she always deployed on this subject, the flat acknowledgement of a weight that was permanent rather than acute. "But I think maybe you can miss someone and still be okay. I think those two things can both be true at the same time." Elena sat down across from her. "They can," she said. "Yes." "Did you figure that out from experience or from books?" "Experience," Elena said. "The books came later." Ruby nodded, as if this confirmed a hypothesis. She kept drawing. "Pa's different too," she said. "He laughs sometimes now. Not loud, but sometimes when you say something he thinks is funny, he does this thing where—" She smiled at the drawing. "You know how he almost laughs?" "I know how he almost laughs." "Last week he actually laughed. A real one, I counted." Elena looked at her daughter. The word arrived quietly in her mind, without announcement, simply the accurate word for the person across the table from her, and felt something that she had no particular interest in analyzing, because some things are better held than examined too closely. "What was funny?" she asked. "Theodore chased a chicken into the barn and then got confused about how to get out, and when Pa went to look, he just stood there in the middle of the barn looking embarrassed." Ruby grinned. "It was very funny. Theodore has no dignity at all." "He doesn't," Elena agreed. She got up and started on supper, and Ruby kept drawing, and outside the Wyoming spring was doing what it did. Tentative and real and never quite as warm as you hoped, but genuinely there, which was its own kind of virtue. It was Aldous Fitch, of all people, who said the thing that settled something in Elena she hadn't known needed settling. She ran into him in June, outside the courthouse where she'd gone to deal with a land registration question that had come up in the spring accounts. He tipped his hat and asked how the ranch was coming along, and she told him honestly, well, with a tighter margin than ideal, but working toward better. "You know," Fitch said, "when Cole came in here in January, I didn't know what to make of it. I'll be honest." He adjusted his hat against the sun. "I've been in this office long enough to see people make decisions in distress and call it judgment. I was watching for that." "And?" Elena said. "By February I had stopped watching for it." He said it plainly, as a fact. "Your husband knows what he has now. You can see it in how he talks about the operation. That's not a man who married in distress." He paused. "I thought you might want to know that someone had noticed." He went back into the courthouse because he was a practical man with work to return to. Elena stood in the June sun outside the courthouse in Iron Ridge, Wyoming, and let that settle into the place where it belonged. Not the praise of it, exactly, but the simpler, harder-to-come-by thing that lived inside it. The confirmation that what was real had become visible, that the work had produced what work produces when it is honest and sustained. She had come here with $43 and a carpet bag and no plan beyond the next 2 weeks. She had stood on a platform in October and refused an envelope that would have sent her back to a life that no longer had room for her. She had made lists on the backs of envelopes and driven a hired horse 4 miles on a cold road and reorganized a pantry and consolidated 3 years of misaligned ledgers and stood in a small post office and said the honest thing instead of the easy one. None of it had been smooth. None of it had gone the way she would have drawn it up if someone had asked. There had been cold and loss and a sustained effort to refuse the story other people wanted to tell about her, and there were still people in this town who held their original opinion and probably always would. But she was standing in the sun outside the courthouse, and the ranch was real, and the work was real, and what she had built with Cole and Ruby in the house 4 miles east on the Bitter Creek Road was as real as anything she had ever known. She walked back to the wagon, and she drove home. The summer of that first year passed the way good summers do when you are too busy to properly notice them, in pieces, in the specific texture of particular days rather than as a whole season. Elena would remember it later not as a continuous thing, but as a series of moments that had weight to them. The morning in July when Cole came in from the south pasture and said the herd count was the best it had been in 3 years, and the way he said it, quietly, as if he didn't want to startle the fact by speaking it too loudly. The afternoon Ruby fell out of the cottonwood tree she had been explicitly told not to climb, and the 20 minutes of controlled panic before it became clear that what she had was a sprained wrist and a story she would be telling for years rather than anything worse. The evening in August when the three of them sat on the repaired porch after supper and watched a thunderstorm build over the mountains to the west, the light going green and strange before the rain came, and nobody said anything much because nothing much needed saying. These were not dramatic moments. That was the thing about them. The drama had happened, in October on a train platform, in December in a cold yard, in the sustained quiet pressure of a town deciding what to make of something it hadn't planned on. The drama was the material from which something had been built. What you lived in afterward, if you were lucky and careful and willing to do the actual work, was the thing itself. Less exciting, considerably more valuable. The ranch turned a corner in August, in the practical accounting sense. The summer grazing arrangement with Dornan had performed as Elena had projected. The supply renegotiations had held, and the cattle prices from the southern markets came in slightly above what Cole had planned for, which meant the margin that had been dangerously thin in February was, by late summer, something that could more honestly be called a cushion. Small. Not to be taken for granted, but real. Cole stood over the ledger on a Tuesday evening in August, looking at the numbers Elena had consolidated for the quarter, and he was quiet for a long time. "This is the first time in 4 years," he said, "that I've looked at the summer numbers and felt like I was actually ahead of it." "You are ahead of it," Elena said, "by a modest but meaningful amount." "How do you separate modest from meaningful?" "Modest means it's not large. Meaningful means it changes what you can do next." She set down her pen. "You can repair the north pasture fence properly instead of patching it again. You can look at the additional stock before spring instead of ruling it out. Those are real decisions that weren't available to you 6 months ago." He looked at her. He had gotten, over the months, somewhat better at saying things on the outside that he was thinking on the inside. Not dramatically better, not in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had stood in a cold yard and said, "I want to ask you to stay with all the poetry of a fence post." But better. "I wouldn't have seen it this clearly without you," he said. "You would have gotten there," she said. "It would have taken longer." "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "You knew what the problems were. You were managing too many things at once to address them. That's a resource problem, not a capability problem." She paused. "There's a difference." He looked at her with the particular expression that she had come to understand was the closest he got to open affection in a functional context. Not soft, but warm in its specific way, the way a well-built stove is warm rather than the way a fire is warm. Steadier, more reliable, less spectacular. "Ruby asked me something last week," he said. "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were staying forever." He let that sit for a moment. "I told her that was a question better put to you than to me." Elena looked at her husband, at the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes, and the hands that showed every year of the work he'd done. "What did she say to that?" "She said she figured the answer was yes, but she wanted it confirmed." He paused. "She also said she was going to ask you herself, but she wanted to let you settle into the summer first because you seemed busy." Something pulled at the corner of Elena's mouth. "That's very considerate of her." "She's a considerate child when it suits her purposes." Elena got up and poured 2 cups of coffee because the evening had gotten cool and the kettle was already there, and she brought them both back to the table and sat down. and they drank their coffee in the kitchen of a house that had been repaired in the places where it needed repairing, in the particular comfortable quiet that two people arrive at when they have learned how to occupy the same space without filling all of it with noise. "Forever," Elena said, after a while. Cole looked at her. "Tell Ruby the answer is yes," she said. The question of Margaret Holt resolved itself not through confrontation or argument, but through the slow, unsexy process of time and evidence. This was not the resolution Elena would have chosen if she'd been writing the story. She would have chosen something more definitive, probably, a single decisive moment where the truth of the situation became undeniable and the opposition collapsed. That was not how it worked. What happened was that Margaret Holt continued to hold her position, and the world continued to hold its own position. And over the course of a year, those two things slowly created a gap that became increasingly uncomfortable for anyone standing in it. By autumn, the number of people willing to stand in it with her had diminished to a small and fairly consistent group of 3 or 4, most of whom had their own reasons for wanting to find fault with Cole Callahan that had nothing to do with Elena at all. The shift came in increments. Helen Partridge's husband, the attorney who read rooms carefully, was one of the first to make it legible. He came to Cole in September with a land boundary question that he could theoretically have taken to anyone, and had apparently chosen the Callahan Ranch specifically, which in Iron Ridge's particular social arithmetic meant something. He sat at the kitchen table and talked to Elena about the account records with the attention of a man who had encountered unexpected competence and was revising his expectations accordingly. He went back to his office and apparently revised some other things too, because the tenor of conversations in certain corners of town shifted in a way that Mercer reported to Elena with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a favorable verdict. Margaret Holt came to Elena in October. A year, almost to the day, from the train platform. She came to the ranch, which took something. Elena could see that. It was not easy for Margaret Holt to drive 4 miles east on the Bitter Creek Road and knock on the door of a house she had spent a year and a quarter treating as the site of a mistake. She did it anyway, which Elena filed as information. She came in the afternoon while Cole was out in the pasture. Ruby was at her lessons in town. Elena was alone in the kitchen working on the winter supply inventory, and she heard the knock and opened the door and found Margaret Holt standing on the repainted porch with her hands folded in front of her and her jaw set in the way that meant she was committed to something difficult. "Mrs. Callahan," Margaret said, "I wondered if I might come in." Elena stepped back from the door. "Coffee?" she said. "Please." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Elena had first consolidated the ledgers, where Cole had looked at the quarterly numbers and felt, for the first time in years, like he was ahead of something. It had the quality of a place that had absorbed a great deal without showing most of it on the surface. Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She was looking at the kitchen, at the organized shelves, the clear table, the general sense of a room that was being managed by someone who knew what they were doing. Elena let her look. There was information in it she was welcome to. "I owe you an honest conversation," Margaret said finally. "All right," Elena said. "When Gerald turned you away at the station..." She stopped, chose different words. "When that happened, I thought I understood what you were. A woman who had come out here representing herself one way and was discovered to be another way. Gerald's account of it was..." She paused again. "Gerald tells things the way that puts him in the best position. I've known that my whole life, and I chose not to account for it properly." Elena waited. "What I did with that, the bank, the conversations, that wasn't protecting Cole. I've told myself it was, but that's not honest." Margaret looked at her coffee. "Cole Callahan made a choice, and I didn't like it, and I tried to make it difficult because I thought I knew better than he did." She looked up. "I didn't, clearly." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the distance, one of the horses made a sound. Elena had thought occasionally about what she would say if this conversation ever happened. She had several versions of it in her mind. The version where she was cool and measured, the version where she said the hard true thing, the version where she was generous in a way she wasn't entirely sure she felt. Sitting here now, she found that what she actually wanted to say was none of those versions. "It was a hard year," Elena said. "The first part of it, especially. The talk made things harder than they needed to be." She held the woman's eyes. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter, because it did. Margaret nodded. She had clearly expected this. But I'm not carrying it the way I was, Elena said. She said it carefully, because it was true and she wanted to be accurate about it. What you did didn't break anything. It made me work harder to prove what was already true, which is not the same thing. She paused. What I'd ask from here is just to be left alone to do what I'm doing. No more conversations I'm not part of. That's all. That's fair, Margaret said. I think so. They finished their coffee. They talked, briefly and carefully, about the winter ahead, about the cattle prices, about a road repair that the county board was supposedly going to address, but probably wouldn't until spring. It was not a warm conversation. It was not a friendship beginning. It was two women talking plainly with each other, which was its own kind of thing and not nothing. At the door, Margaret stopped. My sister-in-law, she said, Cole's first wife. Elena had known this, that Margaret and Cole's late wife had been connected by family, which was perhaps part of what had complicated Margaret's feeling about the remarriage. She was a very particular person, specific in the way she loved things. I didn't think anyone else would. She stopped. That's not the right way to put it. No, Elena said. I understand what you mean. She would have liked that Ruby is doing better, Margaret said. That's all I'll say about it. She walked back to her wagon. Elena stood in the doorway and watched her go and felt the October air on her face. Cold, coming in from the north already. The same north wind that had been there a year ago when she'd arrived in this territory with $43 and no plan and a determination not to be moved by any of it. She had not known then what she was building. You never did, she thought. You just kept making the next decision and the next one and the one after that. And if you were honest and you were willing to stay with the work through the parts that didn't feel like progress, sometimes you looked up and found yourself somewhere you hadn't planned on being. Somewhere better. She went back inside and finished the inventory. What? Ruby turned 10 in March of the second year, and by that point she had developed into someone who was distinct enough from the child Elena had met on the frozen street in October of the previous year that the comparison was instructive. She was still watchful. She was still direct in the way that occasionally made adults reassess the age they were talking to. She still had opinions about turnips, but something had settled in her. Some chronic low-level alertness that Elena recognized, now that she knew to look for it, as the vigilance of a child who has been uncertain about things that children should not have to be uncertain about. Whether the household would hold, whether the person responsible for managing things was managing them, whether it was safe to want something, because wanting something always carried the risk of losing it. That watchfulness had not disappeared. Elena didn't think it would entirely. It was too thoroughly built into the way Ruby moved through the world, but it had quieted. There were mornings now when Ruby came downstairs and ate her breakfast and went about her day with the specific ease of someone who is not, at any point, doing a background calculation about whether things are all right. The calculation had been running so long that its absence was noticeable. For Ruby's birthday, Cole produced the thing he had been working on in the barn for 6 weeks, with a secretiveness that Ruby had chosen, with great difficulty, to respect. It was a writing desk, a small one, sized for her, built from good ash wood with a surface that he'd sanded smooth and finished carefully, and a row of small cubbies along the back for pencils and notebooks and whatever else needed organizing. He carried it upstairs to her room while she stood in the hallway doing a credible impression of someone maintaining composure, and when he set it down by her window, she walked over to it and ran her hand along the top and didn't say anything for a moment. Well, Cole said. It's exactly right, Ruby said, which was the highest designation, reserved for the apple cake and a handful of other things that had fully met her standard. She sat down at it immediately and opened her sketchbook to a new page and began to draw, and Cole stood in the doorway of her room, looking at his daughter at her desk with an expression that Elena, watching from the hall, would not have tried to describe. Some things were better just witnessed. Later that night, after Ruby had gone to bed, Cole sat at the kitchen table and said, "She's going to be fine." Elena looked at him. "She was always going to be fine. You don't know that." "I know her," Elena said. "She was going to be fine. It was just going to take longer without someone in her corner." She paused. "Which is true of most people." Cole was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing he did occasionally, where he was clearly working through a feeling and deciding what proportion of it to give language to. He reached a decision. "When you came to the ranch that first morning," he said, "I watched you walk up to the house and I thought, this is going to be complicated." "You were right." "I was." He looked at her. "I also thought, she looks like someone who's going to be here." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know what that means exactly. Just that some people look like they're passing through and some people look like they're looking for something to be part of. You looked like the second kind." Elena thought about this. About the woman who had stood on a train platform with a carpet bag and $43 and the specific fury of someone who has just been told that who they are is not acceptable. About the woman who had walked into a hardware store and seen a notice in the lower corner of a window and made a decision that was part calculation and part something that didn't have a clean name. About what she had been looking for and whether looking was even the right word for it, or whether it was more accurate to say she had been moving in a direction without knowing the destination and had arrived somewhere that fit. "I think that's right," she said. The ranch in the second year continued to do what honest work continues to do when it is properly managed. It grew slowly, in the way that actual things grow rather than the way stories about growth tend to describe it. Not a sudden expansion, not a dramatic turn of fortune, a series of small good decisions that compounded. The additional stock Cole had been able to consider, now that the margins allowed for consideration, performed well through the second summer. The north pasture fence, properly repaired rather than patched, held through a winter that was rougher than the first. The supply arrangements held. The Dornan grazing lease renewed on terms that worked for both operations, and in the process of renewing it, Cole and Bill Dornan arrived at an informal agreement about sharing equipment during the peak seasons, which saved both of them money that neither of them had been spending optimally. None of it made the newspaper. None of it was the kind of thing that anyone stood up and remarked upon in public. But it accumulated, the way water accumulates behind a good dam. Not dramatically, just steadily, just building. In June of the second year, Mercer told Elena that the Callahan operation had the reputation in the surrounding area of being one of the better-run mid-sized ranches in the valley. He told her this while tallying her supplies, not as a compliment, but as a commercial fact. He was explaining why two other ranching families had been asking him about supply arrangements similar to the consolidated deal the Callahans had, and he wanted to know if Cole would be willing to talk to them about how he'd structured it. "He'll talk to them," Elena said. "You can tell them that." "I thought so." Mercer made a note in his ledger. "You know, when you first walked into this store and asked about work, I didn't—" He stopped. "I know what you didn't think," Elena said without rancor. "I should have thought differently," he said. He said it without making it into more than it was, just an honest statement, plainly delivered. "You were honest with me about what the situation was," Elena said. "That mattered more than the rest." He nodded and went back to his ledger, and they finished the transaction in the comfortable way of people who have established a working trust and don't need to make a ceremony of it. The moment that stayed with Elena longest, the one she returned to in later years when she thought about how things had actually gone, what the truth of it was beneath the surface of events, happened in September of the second year, on a Tuesday afternoon with no particular significance attached to it. She was in the kitchen. Ruby was at the table doing her arithmetic, frowning at a column of figures with the focused displeasure of someone who has found an error and is working backward to find where it came from, which was, Elena had noted, exactly how she herself approached a reconciled ledger. Cole was outside. She could hear him at the fence line, the distant regular sound of work. Theodore. The old dog had moved, over the course of the summer, from his permanent station on the porch to a spot just inside the kitchen door, which Elena had interpreted as a concession to his age and the fact that the kitchen was reliably warm. He was asleep in his corner now, his chest rising and falling in the slow way of very old dogs. And the late afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it came in September, low and golden and slightly melancholy in the particular way of September light everywhere. Ruby looked up from her arithmetic. "Elena," she said. "Do you think it's possible for a place to be yours even if you didn't start there?" Elena stopped what she was doing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ruby frowned at her paper, though not at the arithmetic anymore. I was reading something in my history book about land and belonging, and it said something about how people are from the places they're born, which made me think, you weren't born here. Pa was. I was. She tapped her pencil on the table. But it feels like you're from here. It feels like you belong to this place the same as us. Elena looked at her daughter, at this child who had drawn her from memory in a sketchbook, and saved a ham bone for soup, and held her hand at the courthouse, and decided, with the authority of someone who had thought about it carefully, that the answer to the question of forever was yes, before she even asked it. I think, Elena said slowly, that belonging to a place is less about where you started and more about what you've put into it, what you've built and repaired and worried about and taken care of. She paused. This house, this land, the people in it. She looked at Ruby directly. I've put everything I have into this place. So yes, I think it's mine. Ruby considered this. That's a better answer than the history book, she said. History books are good for some things, Elena said. Not everything. Ruby went back to her arithmetic. Elena went back to what she was doing. Theodore made a sound in his sleep that might have been a dream, or might have been just the weight of being very old and very comfortable. Outside, Cole's work sounds continued their steady rhythm. The fence line, the pasture, the particular ordinary music of a working ranch going about its afternoon. There was a version of Elena Navarro who had gotten on a train in Boston in October of the previous year and had been unmade by what happened when she arrived, who had taken the envelope Gerald Holt held out to her and gone back to Tilton Street and the narrow room and the accounting of every small kindness received and its expected return. That version was possible. It had been right there, available. The morning she sat in the train station and her eyes did the thing they did without her full permission. She had not become that version. She wasn't entirely sure she could take credit for that. Some of it was stubbornness. Some of it was a very specific and arguably irrational refusal to be moved. And some of it was the particular accident of a small girl with escaping braids who had run toward her in a frozen street with the faith of someone who has decided, without sufficient evidence, that a person can be trusted. Ruby had made that decision before Elena had done anything to earn it, which was either foolishness or the most accurate kind of intelligence, the kind that reads what's actually there before the performance of it, the way you might hear a true note before the musician has decided what to play. The truth Elena had come to, slowly and without making a speech of it, was this. You do not find belonging the way you find a destination on a map. You build it. You build it out of the ordinary materials of ordinary days and the ledgers and the biscuits and the conversations that happen at kitchen tables at midnight and the fences that need repairing and the children who come downstairs for water and say things that stay with you for years. You build it imperfectly because you are imperfect, and the people you build it with are imperfect, and the land itself is imperfect in the specific ways that land is. Unpredictable, demanding, indifferent to your plans, magnificently and sometimes brutally itself. What she had with Cole was not the love she might have written for herself when she was young enough to write such things. It was something harder to describe and more difficult to damage. The specific regard of two people who have seen each other work through something that was genuinely hard and have come away from it with a clear-eyed sense of what the other person is made of. He was not demonstrative. He was not easy. He was honest in the way that some people are honest when they've decided it costs less, in the long run, than the alternative. And she had decided the same thing, and between those two decisions, something had grown that was not spectacular but was deeply, specifically real. She loved him. She hadn't said it, not in those words. They weren't people who moved directly in that territory. But she knew it the way she knew the ledger figures when they were right. Not from being told, but from the numbers adding up to something that couldn't be anything else. She thought he knew it too. In October, exactly 2 years after the train platform, Elena walked the property line of the Callahan Ranch on a morning when the light was doing the thing it did in October, clear and cold and making everything look like it had been brought into focus from a slightly blurry version of itself. She walked it not for any particular reason, not because she needed to check the fence or assess the grazing or do any of the practical things that usually brought her to the edges of the land. She walked it because she wanted to. The land went from the north pasture fence down along the creek where the cottonwoods were turning, following the water past the point where the Dornan property began on the eastern boundary and around through the scrub pine stand where the oldest of Cole's heifers had gotten herself turned around in the dark and couldn't find her way back. She walked all of it. It took the better part of 2 hours. It was hers. Not in the simple legal sense, though that was true too, but in the sense that Ruby had been circling around at the kitchen table in September. She had put herself into it. It had asked for what she had, and she had given it, honestly, without reservation. And in return it had given her the thing she had not known she was looking for, a place that needed exactly what she had, and people who could see what she was without requiring her to be a different version of it. She stood at the south fence line and looked back at the house. The painted porch, the steady chimney smoke, the window of Ruby's room where the desk sat angled to catch the morning light. And she thought about the woman she had been on the train. Afraid, though she wouldn't have called it that. Determined, which was real, but wasn't the whole story. She had been, more than anything, someone who had not yet found the thing that matched what she could do. That was the loss she had been carrying without knowing it. Not the loss of the plan that had failed, or the home she'd left, or the mother who was gone. The loss of not yet knowing where she fit. She knew now. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was quieter than that, and more durable. The kind of thing you don't announce, because announcing it would somehow diminish it, would make it smaller than the fact of it. She just stood in the October light on her land and knew it, and then she turned around and walked back to the house, because supper needed starting, and Ruby would be back from her lessons soon, and Cole's boots were on the porch, which meant he'd come in at some point, and she wanted to ask him about the north fence section before the light was gone. Ruby appeared at the end of the road just as Elena reached the porch, a small figure on a borrowed horse, her braid already halfway undone, managing the reins with the casual competence she'd been developing for 2 years now. She raised a hand when she saw Elena. Elena raised a hand back. The dog on the porch opened one eye, assessed the situation, and went back to sleep. Elena went inside. There was work to do, and she had everything she needed to do it. That was not a small thing. Most people spent considerable portions of their lives without both of those being true at the same time, and she was old enough to know it and young enough to use it, and she was not going to waste a moment of it on anything less than exactly what it was. She built the fire up. She started the supper. She listened to Ruby's footsteps on the porch, and Cole's voice asking how the ride home had been, and Ruby's voice saying fine, except for the part where Henderson's dog ran out at the road and spooked the horse, and the sound of the two of them coming through the door together, tracking cold air and the particular liveness of people who have been outside in October doing real things. This was the life. Not the life she had planned. The life she had built, out of the wreckage of a plan, out of $43 in a carpet bag, and one refusal to take an envelope that would have sent her somewhere smaller. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of supper and the sound of Ruby explaining, in considerable detail, the exact behavior of Henderson's dog and what she thought should be done about it, and Cole making the brief responses that indicated he was listening and had opinions about Henderson's dog that he was mostly keeping to himself, and Elena moving through the kitchen doing the work of the evening, present in every particular, fully in the only life she had. Outside, the Wyoming October was doing what it did, cold and clear and very large, the sky going gold over the mountains to the west in a way that would have been beautiful to anyone who bothered to look at it. Nobody inside was looking at it just then. They were doing other things, living things, the kind that don't make good paintings but make everything else possible. The supper was ready when it needed to be ready. They sat down together and ate it. That was all. That was everything.